Welcome to the Galien Foundation Week of Innovation. Our objective this week is to provide additional background for our largest annual event, the Galien USA Awards, to be held this Thursday in New York, in conjunction with our annual Galien Forum of speakers representing top scientific experts and leaders in global health. Because the mission of Galien is innovation to improve the human condition, we have developed this new webinar series to give our nominees for Best Pharmaceutical, Best Biotech, and Best MedTech product greater visibility in describing their journey of medical discovery. This year's Galien USA Awards has a record 67 nominees in our three categories, from 54 companies covering 13 diverse therapeutic areas, ranging from cancer, cardiology, and neurosciences to infectious and very rare genetic diseases. We will be looking closely at the products in all these critical areas throughout the week. Because of the number of nominees and the range of conditions represented by all of this excellent science, the Galien USA Awards Committee has decided to host a series of 10 webinars prior to Thursday's award ceremony, where the winners in each of the three best of categories will be announced. The 10 webinars will drill down on the therapeutic focus of the products, the quality of the science behind them, and most important, the patient clinical impact. It's intended to give our awards attendees, the media, and the public a fuller picture of the innovation behind the medicine. In the Best MedTech category, which is our focus today, we will be holding 3 webinars due to the very large number of products representing this important field. I and my fellow members of the awards committee decided to arrange each of the 3 webinars to center on specific therapeutic segments. These are, first, diagnostics, digital therapeutics, and personalized medicine. Second, cardiovascular, medical, and implant devices. And third, other therapeutic areas. This webinar, in the hour that we've allotted, is devoted to the nominees in diagnostics, digital therapeutics, and personalized medicine. What we cover today relates to the central question: how far are we from achieving the health system world of the connected patient? To provide some context, medical devices are at the heart of healthcare's search for innovations that increase process efficiencies, improve patient outcomes, and realize the ambitions of a value-based payment system based on data from connected, digitally enabled products. Our segment focuses on the front line as healthcare providers confront the many implications of an emerging infrastructure called the Internet of Things, or IoT, where products, software, and analytical applications like AI are merging to shape the future of clinical operations and workflow. The product nominees demonstrate how such technologies can work in practice in key therapeutic areas. Before I turn to our panelists, I want to note that the webinar includes some time for audience questions. There's a link on your screen where you can submit questions, and those will appear for me. I'm going to start with introducing our nominees and their participating scientific and clinical representatives who are joining me for the webcast. The first nominee that will start to appear on your screen is Kate Rosenbluth. She's the founding CEO and CSO of Cala Health, creators of the Cala Trio. The second nominee is Barbara Fant, president of Clinical Research Consultants Incorporated, representing the Custom Flex artificial iris. Yuri Maricic, chief medical officer and head of development of Pear Therapeutics, creators of Reset and Reset-O. Mark Milton Edwards, head of product and digital health solutions for Teva Pharma, representing ProAir Digihaler. And Eric Mays, CEO of Endomag, creators of MagTrace and Centimag magnetic localization system. Thank you all for joining me today. Before we begin our discussion, we'd like the audience to participate in a poll. We are going to push that poll to your screens, and we'd like to give you just a couple of minutes to consider the questions that we have before you, and then we'll talk at the end. We'll reveal the results of the poll. So if my friends who are going to push the poll can do that. What is the most important single element of a future global policy agenda to advance health innovations that improve the human condition? Now, the problem here might be just to choose one, so take your time. There's some good choices. So while you're considering that, I'll also note that there is a link to a 100-word statement by each of the companies. So you can look at a quick summary of what each of the products is all about. And I also shared that on Twitter, and the Galien Foundation retweeted that link. So if you want to go to Twitter, you can find the Galien Foundation, or you can find me at Susannah Fox and find the link. Now, in preparation for the panel, we forwarded a set of questions to the panelists. And I'm going to read the questions so you can think about the questions that we're about to hear from each of the panelists in turn. The first is, in what way does your technology represent a breakthrough over the previous standard of care? And how significant was the level of unmet medical need? The second question, is there a measurable impact you can cite on clinical outcomes for patients with this product? What's been the clinician response to the product thus far? And the third question that we asked panelists to consider, what challenges did your company confront in transitioning from early proof of concept to regulatory clearance for sale? Are there any lessons from your experience that might add to a better public understanding or awareness of the medicine innovation process? So, and since the motivating question for this panel is focused on the connected patient, I would be particularly interested to hear how you included patients themselves in the development or testing of the innovation. So Kate, I'll start with you, please. Oh, you might be on mute.
Are you? Terrific. Well, thank you, Susannah, and to the entire Galien team and foundation. On behalf of our team at Cala Health and the many patients living with essential tremor, thank you so much for the kind invitation to share our story behind Cala Trio. Trio is a breakthrough therapy for an impactful, common, and yet historically overlooked condition called essential tremor. The technology itself is a wrist-worn electrical stimulation therapy. I can show it to you right here. It is a wrist-worn device with a cloud-connected charging base station. No drugs have ever been brought to market to treat essential tremor. In fact, the only drug labeled for ET is a common beta blocker called propranolol, and patients' only other option is brain surgery. This new therapy, this bioelectronic therapy, is truly patient-centered, both in the technology itself as well as in its history that I'll walk through briefly. Trio gives patients a highly safe, effective, non-pharmacologic, non-surgical option, and patients access it through a patient-centered care model. Physicians send us a prescription, and we drop ship product directly to patients' doorstep and help them throughout the therapeutic journey without ever needing to leave home, which has been particularly critical through this recent pandemic. I was motivated to start Cala. I'm our founder and chief scientific officer. by seeing really the tremendous burden that essential tremor has on patients' lives. I took a few months to do observation as part of the Stanford Biodesign program in Stanford Hospital and clinics. And I remember it like it was just yesterday, seeing a man, tears streaming down his face, learning that he was not a candidate for a surgery called deep brain stimulation surgery. His hands shook from this condition, essential tremor. It's a very common condition here in the US. About 8 million people live with hand tremors, of which about 7 million are from essential tremor, and most of the remainder are from a more commonly known condition called Parkinson's disease. This man was explaining he couldn't write a letter to his wife, he couldn't sign a check, he couldn't have a cup of coffee with a friend without spilling it. And he was absolutely devastated learning that he couldn't have this surgery. So my background is as in neuroscience and engineering. And I started wondering why, if we can treat tremor by implanting a battery pack in the chest wall, running wires up into the brain, why can't we instead reverse engineer that system? Why can't we use the body's own nervous system, its beautiful, intricate network of targeted wires, to stimulate the same location in the brain and do it from the wrist? We sent out a simple survey for those innovators and entrepreneurs listening to this. It was a simple survey by SurveyMonkey. We received thousands of responses in just the first 24 hours, and we knew that not only was this a tremendously large unmet need, it was also an accessible need. These patients were looking for better therapeutic options. So we began the scientific, clinical, and importantly, patient-centric journey. We discovered how to use the motion sensors on board the device to calibrate the therapy to each patient's tremor, to detect their unique physiology and set the waveform to give that individual patient relief. And we began using those same motion sensors to actually measure every dose by every subject. We opened a clinic and we set a goal of having patients and providers or caregivers in the clinic every day. We encourage new patients, employees, I should say, through the clinic to get to know our patients. And I know that for many of us, that clinic is still where we go to fill our cup, really seeing the joy that therapy brings. As we built out our robust and clinical scientific evidence, we obtained regulatory clearance through the de novo pathway at the Food and Drug Administration and ran the largest study ever in the field with 26 sites, 263 patients, and importantly, in addition to the gold standard clinical scales, almost 22,000 individual sessions using those motion sensors to measure every dose by every subject. So pulling this back to the patient, that's really what continues to motivate us every day. And thanks again for the invitation.
Thanks so much, Kate. Barbara, can you please share your answer to the question that you chose?
Thanks, thanks, Susannah. And it is really a privilege to be here and to be nominated for this award. I'd like to recognize Human Optics, the manufacturer of the Custom Flex artificial iris, who is a co-nominee along with my company, Clinical Research Consultants. The Custom Flex artificial iris is the world's first and only FDA-approved treatment for aniridia. It was first developed in 2002, and we began working with the company actually back in 2007 to try to get them to bring this particular technology into the US. So the device is indicated for treatment of full and partial aniridia. And the hallmark of aniridia is the absence of an iris in the eye. So the iris in the eye is the colored part of the eye. So it not only gives you the cosmetic appearance of the color in your eye, but it plays an important role in the eye's function and in the optical system of the eye. And so it influences how much light, it controls how much light gets into the eye. And so patients that do not have an iris have tremendous light sensitivity, glare, loss of depth of field, because they do not either have an iris or they have they've lost the function of their iris or they've had damage through trauma. So as I said, the hallmark of aniridia is a partial or complete absence of the iris. And this can occur due to a genetic defect. About 1 in 50,000 to 100,000 babies born in the US every year are born without an iris. And this is either a chromosomal defect or another genetic condition. Patients often have damage to the iris. Sports injuries are common. So baseballs, soccer balls, kids get hit in the eye or adults get hit in the eye. The eye is a very very delicate organ in the body, and so these hard hits to the eye can cause tremendous damage to the eye. Other fish hooks, bungee cords, some of the worst traumatic injuries we've seen have been bungee cord injuries where the bungee cord, snaps back and hits you in the eye. Tree branches, other types of injury and such can damage the eye. And before the custom flex artificial iris, surgeons had very limited technique. They had surgical techniques to repair the iris. Patients could wear colored contact lenses or sunglasses, dark sunglasses, but those are really the only treatments that were available for aniridia. So the advent of the custom flex artificial iris has been a great benefit, not only to surgeons who are looking for this novel technique to treat aniridia, but also to patients who with the implant of the artificial iris have both their visual symptoms that are treated as well as their cosmetic symptoms and such. And the iris can be implanted in children as young as 3 years of age. And this is particularly important in adolescents and the young children who have difficulty with navigating school and such and being in fluorescent light. So if you think about it, if you've gone to the eye doctor and you've had your eyes dilated and you walk out in the sunlight and you know how intense that sunlight can feel, well, magnify that about 1,000 times and figure out that that's what your life is like every day, every minute of your life if you have aniridia. So the custom flex artificial iris has been a real game changer for both patients as well as for surgeons for treatment of aniridia. Getting this device through the FDA regulatory process was definitely, it was a long haul for us. It was definitely a long process. So the artificial iris was the first breakthrough device that received pre-market approval through the new breakthrough technology pathway through FDA. So we had a lot of learning experiences going through that particular process. But this really was a lifelong or a passion for those of us in my company, the 12 key opinion leader surgeons who worked on this device, Human Optics, the company that manufactures this device, and the patients who participated in this particular device. As I said, we began working back in 2007 to work with the company to try to bring the device into the US. And finally in 2011, the company was ready to go. We finally had FDA approval to start our clinical studies. And we were ready to walk into the meeting with our investigators to start this study. And the CEO for Human Optics pulled me aside and he said, the board just reorganized and they said, we can't do this study. And so he finally convinced them that they could do the study as long as we didn't lose any money on the study. So everyone pivoted at that point. We became a development partner with Human Optics to get the product into the US and such. Patients, and the way that we could actually afford to do this clinical trial was with great assistance from the patient. So on the medical device sector, you're allowed to charge patients for the cost of the device. And so we worked out a reasonable amount with the company so that we could cover all the expenses patients had to pay for their device, but which were either private pay patients, workers' comp paid for some of the devices for some patients. But we had patients that, they organized bake sales, they did crowdfunding. We had the Lions Eye Institute that stepped up to help with the defray costs of people participating in this study. We had one of our investigators who started a nonprofit foundation strictly to help with financial aspects for patients to be able to afford the device and get into our study. So before we brought the device into the US, there were about 200 patients that have been treated under compassionate use device exemptions. Under our clinical study, we were able to treat 447 eyes and bring this device to market. So it was the first trial, large scientific trial of an artificial iris device. It's the first and again, the world's only FDA-approved device. So really, this has been a game changer for patients for their, in terms of their psychosocial development. It's improved their visual symptoms. It has improved their quality of life. And I can tell you this is, in the 30-some years of doing this type of work, this is the most rewarding project, most rewarding device that we have ever brought to market.
Thank you so much. I did not expect to hear a story of board governance and the importance for a startup or any company to really stay in touch with the board about the meaning of the money that's being spent. So that's really interesting. Thank you. Yuri, I'd love to hear your answer to our questions.
Thanks, Susannah, and thank you also for the invitation, Galien. So I think as many of us know, we in the United States, as well as around the globe, have had an epidemic of substance use and opioid use disorder. And that epidemic has really accelerated in the face of the pandemic. Most patients, almost 90% of patients, receive no treatment at all. And we've seen these rates of the number of affected patients and their families and communities continue to rise through recent surveys by the CDC. We also know that for patients with addiction to cocaine, cannabis, stimulant use disorder, there's no approved product until reset. And for patients with opioid use disorder, medication only works the best when used in conjunction with behavioral treatment. And so Reset and Reset-O are both prescription digital therapeutics that are based on the insight that software can actually treat human disease. So these are both mobile software products where the patient receives a diagnosis from their clinician, if it's appropriate. They actually download the software from the App Store, and then they receive 3 mechanisms of action. The first is an addiction-specific form of cognitive behavioral therapy. The second is a form called fluency training, which helps assess proficiency and reinforces concept mastery. And then the third is an evidence-based approach called contingency management, which is a positive reinforcement mechanism. And so these help to deliver that neurobehavioral treatment. So as part of the development, we had to go through randomized clinical trials because everything that we do is all about outcomes and demonstrating ultimately, can we improve outcomes for these patients in need? That's really what it's about. It's not about the product. It's about how do we help patients and their caregivers. 2, it's around, can we improve access? That's one of the biggest problems here, is there's not access for patients in need. And then 3rd is, can we do that in a way where we overall improve value to the health system? So do we deliver more for each dollar spent? And in our randomized clinical trials, there's been multiple randomized clinical trials for both Reset and Reset-O. For example, in Reset, and these studies were actually conducted through the National Institute on Drug Abuse and sponsored by the NIH, showed a more than doubling in rates of reducing substance use by patients, showed an improvement in patients staying in treatment, or so-called retention, which is very important because it's predictive of long-term outcomes. And interestingly and surprisingly, found patients were even more engaged in their treatment. So they went to more of their face-to-face appointments rather than less. And so this is something that is a real potential for combating the addiction, both substance use and opioid use disorder that's ravaging this country. One of the interesting learnings, as you mentioned, Susannah, what are these? There were many learnings along the way. For example, taking the traditional biomedical development process and marrying that with the agility of traditional software development so that we continue to be able to make these products better as one. But the other is, as we went through the development process in terms of evaluating the products in randomized clinical trials, is then taking that data to FDA. We think it's really important that any treatment, whether it's software, whether it's a medical device, hardware, whether it's a drug, that patients and their healthcare providers deserve that same level of rigor in terms of how is it manufactured, is it safe, does it work? And do you have that independent evaluation by an organization like the FDA? So we also went through the de novo regulatory process. Reset-O received breakthrough status before its market authorization. Reset was, in fact, the first therapeutic software to actually receive a label claim to treat disease. And in the real world now, we see clinicians integrating this into their practice. The big question for them, because of the clinical trials, is not does it work, but rather now, once they see the data, how do I use this? And I think this is exciting because we're seeing more and more, particularly accelerated by the need of access to patients getting treatment. And patients are able to get treatment when and where they need it, which I think is the most exciting and fulfilling. So again, thank you very much for having me here, and thanks for the questions.
And again, you're another example, like Kate, in something that can be delivered at home during the pandemic. That this is something where the access to treatment is even more important as we face this wave, unfortunately, of addiction and relapse that so many people are experiencing. So thank you so much. Mark, we're going to turn to you to hear about your innovation, please.
Thank you very much, Susannah, and to Galien. I'm very pleased to say a few words and represent our whole team. The journey started with just a few individuals, but really it is an army now, who work on the DigiHaler platform. And the DigiHaler platform is actually a combination digital pharmaceutical, so a bit different from some of the other products here. As a pharmaceutical, we've had a rather high hurdle to get over, and it's been many years in terms of regulatory, but I won't focus on the regulatory first. What we do is automatically collect inhaled flow variables every time somebody takes their inhaled medicine. Nobody has ever used that measure before. And so when we started the journey, we were told that we were not doing something validated. But by using inhaled measures and the other high fidelity measures we can pick up with the digital pharmaceutical, we've been able particularly to predict an exacerbation. Predicting exacerbation with an 80% accuracy or greater than 80% accuracy 5 days in advance of it occurring in asthma or in COPD. Now, being able to predict an exacerbation 5 days in advance, of course, gives the opportunity for the patient and for the healthcare professional to do something, to try and reduce the impact of the exacerbation, or of course, remove it entirely. And that, of course, can have a tremendous benefit for them, not only emotionally, but in terms of the healthcare resources that can be avoided. So our DigiHaler platform is now approved with 3 pharmaceutical products, FDA approved, and we're indicated for asthma and COPD. Asthma and COPD affects over 700 million people worldwide. Sadly, it still creates a death, even in what we would call advanced countries like the US, where sadly last year, over 3,500 deaths occurred. And surprisingly, 2/3 of those are thought to be preventable. The clinician and the customer response has been as good as we hoped, and actually, in fact, in some ways better. And prior to launch, we received major orders that were many times greater than our first year of production capacity. That's a nice problem to have. And to try and summarize, I reached out to a few important people to ask them how they would describe our technology. First of all, an academic. And it's not only that we think academics are important in this world, but some of them really have understood the challenges in asthma for some years, particularly Professor Barnes, who's a fellow at the Royal Society in London, at Imperial College, I should say. He's the most widely quoted respiratory researcher in the last 20 years, particularly on the mechanisms of treatment for asthma. And I confirmed he was happy for me to use this quote, but he said quite clearly, you've done something nobody ever thought of with inhaled flow, and you've created an innovation possibly greater than any new drug. Interesting, we're a pharmaceutical digital combination product. Tonya Winders, who is the CEO of Allergy and Asthma Network USA, and the current president of the Global Allergy and Airways Patient Platform, that represents 60 respiratory patient organizations around the world. She confirmed she was happy to say, what you've done is patient-powered innovation. It enables the objective and essential dialogue between patient, healthcare physician that has been lost for many decades. And just in that respect, the customers, of course. The journey for us has been a long journey, like many of the co-presenters here. But in our journey, we've also been able to survey and involve patients in the way that our product presents information to them. So actually to date, and we were surprised, we've surveyed over 4,200 patients. We've consulted with over 500 healthcare professionals and probably around 200 payers now. Of course, we've completed human factors studies for submission. And if I try and summarize the philosophy that we've heard from them, it's been that we should design things which respect, it's not human error, but it's a design challenge. I'm just thinking about that. It's individuals saying, don't change me, I'm human. Design a product for my world. And that's really where we've been trying to focus. So our product has a lower friction for them, that passively monitoring use and unique variables in terms of flow. We pick up 17 data points on every inhalation. And it's been that work and making sure that our product performs just as a non-digital product would do for as long and as quickly, and it starts recording as soon as it's out of the box without any pairing initially. It's been that creation of a product which can live in their world, which then I think enables truly connected capability that this session says we're striving to achieve. So those are just some of the factors. What we overall have had as a design philosophy as well is that we should be with there when they want and need us, not the other way around.
I so appreciate that because sometimes when a member of the public will hear something about the Internet of Things, it sounds kind of scary. It sounds like it could be something out of, Orwell. But in fact, it's really to fit into the patient's lives, to fit into the family's life. And that's the human element of design that really good technology brings to bear. So thank you so much for that. If you're in the audience, we're going to have one more panelist, but you might be experiencing what I, as a judge for the Prix Galien USA, have experienced, which is I fall in love with every single product as it's being presented. And so it becomes really difficult to be a judge. So I have to say this forum is wonderful because it's just a shining example of what we're all about. To answer the question, I will ask Eric to answer the question of your choice, please.
Okay, thank you, Susannah. I've sort of blended my answers together, I think maybe as some of the others have, again, because I think, as you just pointed out, all of these innovations are, meritorious, and, it's exciting for us to see each other present as well, because you realize, it's not just us pushing ahead in our one particular area of specialty, but, all these groups working collaboratively to make healthcare better for people globally, which is very exciting. But anyway, thank you, and thank you to the Galien Foundation for inviting me to represent our team on behalf of our MagTrace and CentiMag surgical localization system. So I wanted to set the stage for why these are improvement over the standard of care by talking about the standard of care that's relatively new. So we're acting in the area of breast cancer. Hopefully most people are aware that October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of this. So breast cancer affects around 2 million women globally at the moment, and despite all the advances in new therapeutics and screening programs, genetic testing, it's expected that will increase, that burden will increase by about 50% by 2030. And this is due to demographic factors, but it's still, despite all of the effort that's gone into addressing breast cancer, there's still many challenges ahead. But that the dynamism in the space has meant that things move pretty quickly. So the current standard of care before our products came in really only became the standard of care in 2010. So if you have a breast tumor that's confirmed and surgery is required, another question that the surgeon will ask is, or want to determine, is whether that tumor has spread to other parts of the body. And as part of that clinical process, they need to examine the lymph nodes that would be the first places to drain from that tumor to see whether disease has spread to those lymph nodes. And prior to 2010, the standard of care was to do what they called an axillary lymph node dissection, which would be to remove the 30-odd lymph nodes in the armpit region, send those off to pathology to have them examined and determine whether there was disease present. And that's a pretty invasive surgery. You risk nerve damage. You risk something called lymphedema, which is where lymph can no longer drain from the arm and your arm can swell up in a very painful condition that continues on for the rest of your life. And so people were thinking, how can we avoid these morbidities? And naturally you think, well, if cancer is going to spread, surely it'll spread to one of these 30 lymph nodes before the others. And so the concept of a search for a sentinel node, the ones that would represent that the disease that started to spread, gained prominence. And in 2010, that became established as the standard of care, which was to find the 1 or 2 lymph nodes that would represent the disease state. And the 2 big RCTs read out in that 2010 timeframe that showed by finding 1 or 2 of these sentinel nodes, you could have the same predictive value as taking out all the lymph nodes, but save all of those morbidities. And so this is a huge benefit, decreasing the amount of unnecessary surgery in breast cancer patients. And so the question is, well, how did they find these 1 or 2 sentinel nodes? And the technology to support that was to inject a radioisotope that's a radio-labeled material, a couple of different types of material, alongside a blue dye. The blue dye would stain all of the lymphatics blue, and then this radio-labeled colloid or nanoparticle would then go through the lymphatics and then get trapped in the first nodes to drain from that tumor. The surgeon then uses a Geiger counter to find these hot nodes, and if they're both hot and blue, then they take them out, and they find generally that on average they take out 2 of these. And it's a great process. It saved a lot of unnecessary surgeries. It saved a lot of these axillary lymph node dissections. But the big challenge was really around availability and scheduling. So this radioisotope technetium has a 6-hour half-life, and that means that patients either need to be injected in nuclear medicine on the day of surgery or the day before at the most. And not every hospital has access to radioisotopes. And so this was the motivation for developing MagTrace and the CentiMag platform. And the concept is, well, rather than having something that has a 6-hour half-life, let's use a magnetic particle that behaves the same way in terms of its flow through lymphatics and getting trapped, but has a 3-year shelf life. So not only can you inject the patient well in advance, they don't need to be on the day of surgery or the day before, but it means that hospitals that don't have access to nuclear medicine can suddenly offer their patients a sentinel lymph node biopsy rather than an axillary dissection. So we got our approval in the US in 2018. We've treated over 50,000 patients to date with MagTrace in over 40 countries, and really saved a lot of those who would have had maybe axillary lymph node dissections. But I think the wrinkle that's interesting for us is because we had this platform that offered physicians a new way to do things, it highlighted some additional benefits, and it allowed them to make some completely new procedures that we didn't even anticipate. In particular, there's a breast disease that could become cancerous. It's called ductal carcinoma in situ, or DCIS. And there are roughly 65,000 of these cases in the US every year, but about 20% of those cases turn into cancer. And the way that you can assess that disease is generally to take the tissue, send it to pathology, and then decide what to do. And because you're having to take all of that tissue and assess it, surgeons were doing a sentinel lymph node biopsy at the same time as that procedure because they couldn't come back later because the radioisotope would time out. And what that meant is they were doing a lot of unnecessary sentinel lymph node biopsies. And in the case of MagTrace, we found that because you could do the injection prior to surgery, and it would maintain its magnetic signature that could be detected by the CentiMag for many days or weeks. If you had a case where you had a DCIS patient the tissue goes off to the pathologist, the pathologist finds that actually it's not cancerous, you can tell that patient, guess what, you don't need a sentinel lymph node biopsy. If they are cancerous, it turns out you do need to do the procedure, but they're already marked. And so you haven't subjected them to, for those patients where it turns out to be negative, you haven't subjected them to an unnecessary sentinel lymph node biopsy. And this has probably been one of the most significant things for us, in that Magtrace is the only product that allows you to do what we call this delayed sentinel lymph node biopsy. And we've had not only surgeons, excited by this, but also feedback from patients saying, your company, your product saved my lymph nodes, and there are no words that I can express of what this means to me, things along those lines. And that, for a team that's developed this product, nothing does mean more to us than that impact that we have on patients. I just wanted to mention a little something, because we talk about the regulatory challenges, and like everyone else mentions here, it was a long process of engagement. It was actually 7 years from when we first went to see the FDA and talk to their group. And our particular challenge was, Magtrace is a nanoparticle, and it involves iron oxide, and materials like this were traditionally used as contrast agents in MRI, and all imaging agents are regulated as drugs. So we thought, oh, well, we're going to have to be a drug when we go to the FDA. But our regulatory path in Europe was one of arguing that it was a medical device, because really what we're doing is not using a drug mode. We're injecting this material, it gets filtered out mechanically by the lymph node, and then we're exciting it with our probe to see its location. And so we propositioned the FDA with this concept, and they said, interesting. We think, given it's a nanoparticle, that we want both CDRH and CDER both looking at this. But we actually got to be the first the first nanoparticle approved as a device, or device primary mode of action, by the FDA in 2018. And this was really an interesting combination of not only the CDER and CDRH, but also the FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence working together for trying to understand how this product that people might normally say is a drug could be a device in its thing. And early engagement, lots of open discussions with the FDA. We found them a really good organization to work with, despite the fact that it takes a long time to get there.
Thank you so much. So before I ask my next question, I want to note again for the audience that you have the opportunity to ask questions of this stellar panel of innovators and scientists. So if you do have questions, go ahead and put those into the Q&A. So one of the things that I'm struck by listening to everybody's presentations is that we are moving quickly toward a time when data is merging with devices, is merging with drugs. And so one of the questions that we at Galien are thinking about is, what can we anticipate as a committee? What can we anticipate as an organization? And initially, I was thinking about 5 years out. Like, what can we look forward to judging in 5 years in terms of innovations? If because of all the stories of how long it takes to get to this point, if you want to stretch that out to 10 years, that would be great. But thinking about your field, thinking about your specialty area, where do you see the innovations heading in terms of the merging of fields, or the pushing of the envelope? And so, Eric, since you just talked and inspired me to ask this question, I'll actually maybe I'll go back up to the top, and Kate, do you want to respond to what what's happening in your field that you're excited about, that you think people are really pushing the envelope on?
Sounds great. And just to say to all of the fellow nominees, I think it is so impressive how you are all pushing this field forward. So when I think to that, 5-10 year timeline, I think there's a couple things that really stand out. One is, as we've been discussing here, just that trend towards connected patients, towards using data, not only for empowering the patient to, being there when the patient needs us, as well as to developing incredibly strong evidence spaces. And evidence, so data in both the service of the patient, of the healthcare system, as well as building up an understanding that really reaches the individual patient level and understanding the differences, the heterogeneity across the population, and predictive analytics. Certainly within there, I imagine that 10 years from now, this awards committee will be looking at many more individualized therapies. So therapies that are really not looking at a one-size-fits-all approach, which in many cases can be driven by everything down to the level of how do you do quality control, training, et cetera, and to really recognize that there is tremendous opportunity to use the combination of sensors and devices, drugs, software as a medical device in order to deliver the individualized therapies for each patient. On that note, certainly one of the areas we are tremendously excited about, I think, at Cala Health and in the field at large is the recognition of electricity as a medicine. The body communicates chemically and biologically and electrically. There's tremendous potential to treat the electrical communications of the body and to do that with therapies that are incredibly accessible and have huge impact across many different disease categories. A few people mentioned some of the breakthrough designations. We were thrilled just last week actually to announce receiving breakthrough designation for expansion into Parkinson's disease, into treating similar tremors as in ET and Parkinson's. And I think that the field of electrical medicines is moving incredibly quickly from end organ implants, from pacemakers when we first understood how it communicates with the body, all the way to spinal cord stimulators, deep brain stimulators. And now we're seeing this world of wearables, sensors, connected patients really intersect exactly, Susannah, as you're bringing up there, across these fields of sort of drugs, technology, devices. And that's just incredibly exciting for the patient.
Awesome, thank you. So I will just note that we are closing in. We have about 10 minutes left. I can't resist, Barbara. I am still thinking about this question that you brought up of board governance, because I think it's a key part of innovation that people don't necessarily talk about as much in terms of bringing your board along on the journey. But so I'll give you the opportunity if you want to talk more about that, or I'd also really, I'm interested in other startups that you are advising through the regulatory process. Or you can just answer the question of what should we expect to see 10 years out?
Thanks, Susannah. Three very interesting and diverse questions to talk about. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about startups and board governance and such. Even though there are a lot of really interesting things in ophthalmology that are occurring with smart devices and smart contact lenses and such, and even the next step with the artificial iris, there's a company that has electronics embedded into a contact lens that then can has an adjustable component in it that can adjust how much light gets into the eye. There's a contact lens that measures glucose, and they're looking at how can they deliver drugs through the contact lens based on glucose readings and such. Brain stimulators and such to improve vision and blindness in patients where we didn't think we had treatments before. So there's a lot of really interesting things that are happening in ophthalmology, and I think devices that you'll see down the road with that. But this whole concept with startups, startups, there are really unique challenges in working with startups, and the bottom line is it comes down to funding, and it comes down to really understanding the process. I always tell my startups it's more important to know what you don't know, and then find the people that know what you don't know to help you develop your product and to help you along the way. In the startup environment, if I work with a project that is a startup and it's venture capital backed, it's a completely different game than working with a product that with a major company like a Fortune 500 company and such. We can't afford to make mistakes because we don't have the money to work with to allow those mistakes. And then the other issue that with startups is that there's so much innovation that's taking place, and they're so excited about the project, different ways that they can go, is that you really have to take a startup company and hone in on what it is that you want to get, what you want to get approved to get you through that regulatory process, and then identify your process. And then once they understand that the regulatory process actually drives all of the other development efforts, then things can work in a very, streamlined manner and very cost-effective manner to get through the process. But when you go back to our product with the artificial iris, I mean, if you look at every hurdle that could have been thrown at us and such, and where we had to pivot. And I remember walking into that meeting, and we were pretty upfront with our surgeons and everybody, the situation they were in, and that product, getting it on the market. I mean, as I said, physicians gave up their fees. It was a passionate project all the way around. And it was just really because every time we saw one of these patients get the device put in, it was such a life-changing, game, changer. And as one of my surgeons said, he said, you don't often get patients that come in and they cry when they, you take the patch off their eye and they see their eye for the first time, and all of a sudden they feel normal and they feel really whole again. So again, these startups is, the innovation that's there, getting through the regulatory hurdles and through the process. And I think Eric mentioned that FDA, working with FDA, and you really have to do and work in partnership with them, because, they're the person that, they're the entity that really controls all the cards and such. But, FDA is working, I work on a number of innovative platforms and such, and FDA is pushing towards collaborative communities. And how can they be a participant, recognizing that there's multiple groups that have to come together to get technology forward, innovative technology forward. So I think that is just the key, identifying all the stakeholders, being really streamlined in terms of, and focused on getting the project through, and just really communicating and working together and being a committed group.
Thank you so much. And you bring up something really important, which might not be visible from the outside, but that the FDA is a learning organization. Sometimes if you're a member of the public or you're a startup, the FDA looks like this fortress that has no windows, but actually it's a fortress that is full of people who are curious and who really want to learn. And that's what I really appreciate about the stories that you guys are telling. Yuri, I'm going to turn to you, and because I was really encouraged to hear that you guys were able to get a behavioral health intervention through the regulatory. So quickly, if you could talk about where you see behavioral health interventions going in the next 5 or 10 years, please.
Sure. And just to echo on FDA, I mean, the FDA's work is so important. It's to protect, but also to promote health, so to help get access to patients for things that work. And we've just really been so grateful for their efforts in helping navigate together with us with that learning mindset. In terms of where we see the next 5 to 10 years, I'll try and be really brief. I would say 2 areas. I think we're seeing convergence of bio plus tech. Previously, there's like tech, and you think Silicon Valley, and then you think bio. Never the two shall meet, and when they do, they're inoperable. But we are actually seeing those converge together, and there's several examples that people have talked to today here, where we're seeing software, hardware, or software plus biopharmaceuticals. And one of the unique things that you mentioned, Susannah, was the ability to then pull in data, not just from randomized clinical trials, but also the real world data, to look at claims data and build out this continuum of evidence so that we can see performance, not just in an experiment, but can we see that performance and better understand it in the real world. So that's like convergence 1. Convergence 2 is around delivery. So all these new therapeutics, particularly the ability to get that data and integrate it into delivery of care, is going to, I think, set off a whole chain reaction, particularly in behavioral health, around different models of care. So it's no longer just doing what we used to do in a brick and mortar, now in front of a video. It's rethinking what is the right amount of a digital treatment, what is the right amount of a face-to-face treatment, how do we understand different subgroups of patients? And that gets a little bit into precision medicine too, which I think is another area we're going to see, where we're going to start to tailor. We're not just treating depression and treating all patients with depression as the same. We're going to actually be able to understand and to titrate that. And then the last thing I'll just say that I'm encouraged about, but I think it's important that we all keep in mind, is that with all the excitement in technology, we don't lose sight of the fact that care is still human. There's been such an increase in like isolation and loneliness. And so it's really important for us to think about how do we bring and converge these different types of treatments together.
Absolutely, I love that. And we are getting close on time, and we are going to, I think we have time for like lightning round from Mark and Eric, and then we're going to share the poll results. Mark, I feel like Yuri really teed you up for individualized medicine and data. So what are we going to see in 10 years?
I mean, that's actually Kate and Yuri teed me up, because I think it is that convergence that, patients live with pharmaceuticals as needed, but they don't necessarily like to be using their pharmaceuticals. They want to be healthy. But if we can incorporate technologies which understand that usage or that lack of usage, then that can lead to better delivery of care. We, as human beings, we tend to like to put things in boxes, and I see that a lot with digital health, that we like sensors, digital therapeutics, behavioral intervention. We like everything split up, but definitely, we live in a chaotic world. Patients' lives are incredibly chaotic. I think of my own mother's 5 kids at home. Lives are chaotic, and actually digital interventions and pharmaceutical and behavioral interventions, they can only come in small pieces into that chaotic world. So we have a better chance if we can take a broader offering to patients, and therefore it's about the patients. It needs to begin with the patients so that it can end with the patients on a better outcome.
Beautiful. Eric, you're going to close us out with your prediction for 10 years from now. What are we going to be looking at?
Okay, so at least in the surgical field, there's a big trend towards minimizing the invasiveness of surgery, and clearly that's what's driving the excitement and enthusiasm behind surgical robotics. I think robotics still has a lot to demonstrate in terms of clinical value and outcomes, but it feels that it will ultimately deliver. The fact that you're putting a system in between the surgeon and the patient gives some opportunity also to improve what the surgeon is doing. Advances in real-time imaging, tissue differentiation. You're adding new layers of data on top of what the surgeon can see through the robotic platform. And so I think this, as everyone noted, convergence is a huge component of what is happening there. And then that's new drugs that might fluoresce with diseased tissue that the surgeon can now see with the robot, where they might not be able to see that live. But also, I think the connectedness in the surgical space is kind of difficult, because everyone tends to think of connectedness as people at home and what they can do there. But if you've got big infrastructure like surgery or radiology, how does that relate to connectedness? And I think underlying all of this is connectedness for patients is giving them more control in their therapy. And part of that is convenience, part of that is understanding. And so I think a lot of new techniques or therapies that improve not only the convenience of how they go about managing their treatment, but also their understanding of the treatment. Better education materials involving them more in their process, particularly in a highly innovative space where all these new therapies are coming in that involve all sorts of technology. I think it's an impetus on industry to help them understand what these things mean to them, to allow them to have control and understanding over their own treatment.
Beautiful. Thank you. That's a beautiful vision. So let's look at the poll results while I close us out. Thank you again to all the panelists for sharing your experience and insights. This webcast is going to be viewable on the Galien Foundation's homepage. And just so we're all aware, we've got some upcoming highlights, Thursday's Galien Forum and the presentation of the 2020 Vagelos Pro Bono Humanum Award to Dr. William Fagey. So let's look at this. What is the most important single element of a future global policy agenda to advance health innovations that improve the human condition. It looks like there was basically a virtual tie: universal access to medicines and vaccines, and investment in population-based primary care prevention and the social determinants of health. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to the audience for being here and participating. And thank you again to the panelists. This was really wonderful. I appreciate all the insights that you shared today.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Best medical technology